Computer. Tonight's subject is very Tisha B'Av friendly, if you will. Maybe that's the wrong term, but it is very appropriate for this time because this is the 9 days leading to Tisha B'Av. It's a time where we traditionally look at various tragedies that took place in the Jewish community. And this particular one is the Chmielnicki massacre of 1648 and 1649. In Jewish literature, it's referred to as Gzeirat Tach v'Tat. Tach and Tat refer to the Hebrew years in which this took place. So let's first ask, how did Jews get into medieval Poland? And this is a pretty straightforward story. It turns out that Poland was a much friendlier place than the Rhineland, than Germany, France. Those are places that had some really virulent anti-Semitism, and they expelled their Jews. They had crusades, the first crusade, the second crusade. Jews really did not fare well in those areas. And Poland was a much freer space than all of that. And you can see here the migrations of Jews from Germany, Austria, Hungary into these areas of Poland. And it was the anti-Semitism that really drove people into Poland. And Poland was actually a very hospitable place for the Jews. We did quite well in Poland. This, by the way, it's 100 years after our episode, but really this is the testimony of Antonio Maria Graziani. He is a papal legate. He works for the Catholic Church, and he writes in his diary, tells us what it was like to live in Poland. And he says, in these principalities, one still comes upon masses of Jews who are not disdained as much as in some other lands. They do not live here under pitiful conditions and do not engage in lowly pursuits, but rather they possess lands, engage in commerce, devote themselves to study, especially medicine and astrology. They possess considerable wealth, and they are not only among the respectable citizens, but occasionally even dominate them. They wear no special marks to distinguish them from Christians, and are even permitted to wear the sword and to go about armed in general. They enjoy equal rights. He is talking about a Jewish community that mixes quite comfortably with a non-Jewish community, and that have capital, and they have wealth, they have learning, they have all of the things that are sort of seen as the advancement in society. These are not things that are born of a moment, and these are developed over centuries. And so when I think of Poland, my original thought, when I was growing up, I always thought of Polish Jews as poor, schleppy. I got Warsaw Ghetto, I've got Tevye in the back of my mind. But that is not really a very accurate picture. The Jews of Poland were quite successful. Part of what made the Jews successful in Poland is, to a certain extent, what made them successful everywhere. They were managers of what's called the arenda system. And the arenda system is a system of sharecropping or leaseholding for Polish nobility. So a Polish noble would have the right to cultivate a piece of land. He would have maybe all of the rights in his area. And that would mean, they would collect taxes for all sorts of things, the use of the mill, production of alcohol. And the Poles needed people who were good at doing this. And that meant you needed people who were literate. And Jewish literacy has always been a distinguishing factor of the Jewish people. And so you had good literate Jews who took care of all of these things. The other principal occupation of the Jews was something that is a centerpiece of many Hasidic stories. Many Hasidic stories tell us about, the Rebbe or a Yankel or whoever is traveling, and he comes to a kretschmer. A kretschmer is an inn that was owned by a Jew. And these were valuable for Jews for a number of reasons. First of all, Jews were excellent traders. They were involved in mercantile interests in almost every place that we know of them, in in medieval Europe and beyond. And that was because Jews had relatives in all places, and they could write letters in Hebrew because Jews spoke Hebrew in almost every place, or there was at least somebody who could speak Hebrew. And they had Talmudic law, they had a set of laws that governed. And so a Jew in Poland could do trading with a Jew in Constantinople. And all you needed was a sea that goes, through the Black Sea from the Bosphorus to Crimea, and maybe takes a little caravan from the Crimea into Poland. And there you have it. You have your trade route. And in that trading, if a Jew came from Crimea with his olive oil, let's say from Turkey, and he was taking it into the market, the Great Fair in Leipzig, so he would have to stop off for the night, and he would stop at a tavern. And so Jews were tavern keepers, and you could even, by the way, get a letter from the Beit Din that would say that you were kosher. Early form of the Hechsher system. But the salient feature here is that Jews were given by the Polish nobility the right to produce and distribute alcohol. The Jews' right to distribute alcohol was exclusive. There's a book that was written, you see it here, I think it's Glenn Diener who wrote this book called Yankel's Tavern. And Yankel's Tavern is about the fact that Jews had the exclusive trade rights. And he writes that part of the reason that they got that exclusive right was because it was assumed that Jews didn't drink. There's a stereotype that Jews are not big drinkers. And so you didn't want, if you gave it to a local Pole, he wasn't such a good candidate because maybe he would drink all of the product. Or maybe he would invite his relatives to drink all of the product. But the Jew was considered trustworthy. I don't know whether this is a well-founded or not well-founded reputation, but such it was. Part of what brings us to our story is the fact that Jews would control the liquor. And so you have Ukrainian peasants who have a fight with their wives or have a bad day, or the crop is withering, and they need to drown their sorrows in a little bit of vodka. Well, they go into Yankel's Tavern and they run up a credit. And then finally, when the crop comes due, Yankel says, you want another drink? You're going to have to pay your tab. Now, he can't live without the drink, so he's got to pay the tab. But he realizes how much of his profit he has already eaten up on his liquor tab. And now you're starting to get a resentment against the Jews because they have now extended credit to this poor Ukrainian farmer, and he's upset about that. Another piece of this puzzle is the baptism tax. The way the Arenda system worked was that the Jew was the manager, and you would bid essentially for the contract. And the farther east you went, the more speculative you were, because the farther east you went, we'll see in a minute, that is a scenario which is very, it's really what we would, in America, we would call it the Wild West. That was the Wild East. And we'll get to how wild that was in a few minutes. But the Polish lords, they were a pampered set. And they just wanted more money every year. And so they turned to their Jew and they said, look, last year you gave me 400 zloty. This year, you're going to have to get me 600 zloty. Last year, it was 15,000 zloty. Next year, it's, 17,000 zloty. And it's not like the Jew had this new cotton gin or a new fertilizer that's going to produce more crops. He had to come up with creative ways to get more money out of the poor peasants. One of the ways that they did that, and perhaps the most controversial of them, was the baptism tax, that the Jew held the keys, since the Polish lord owned everything, and he can control everything. So the Jew held, obviously based on the authority of the Polish nobleman, he held the keys to the baptistry. You had a baby, you want to take him to get baptized, and you want to take him to get baptized because, as I understand it, this is not my area of expertise, but if you're not baptized, you don't get into heaven. I know this because the Pope prayed for all the Jews who died in Auschwitz, who hadn't accepted the Christian Savior and hadn't been baptized. So the idea is that, children died regularly at a young age. Infant mortality was a real thing. So you needed to baptize your child in order to get them into heaven. And in order to do that, you need to pay a sum. And the Jew was there ready to collect. but this took this scenario, this sharecropping scenario, took created a lot of resentment, principally against the Polish lords. But the Polish lords were far in the west. His agent was the Jew who was in your backyard. Okay. Now, the center of this uprising is going to be Bogdan Chmielnicki. And Bogdan Chmielnicki is sort of, this is his statue in the central square in Kiev. And Bogdan Chmielnicki, this is the monument that was created. Now, what's interesting about this is, oh, hold on, I need to go back. Hold on, I apologize. You don't generally put majestic statues of thugs in the center of your most prominent public square, right?
This stands there now. This is the as we speak.
Well, look, Russian drones do what they do, and I don't. I can't. I've never been there myself, but I understand that this is a reasonably current picture of this. So yes, as far as I know, Chmielnicki. Now, this is out of Wikipedia. Wikipedia tells you that the initial draft of the monument, created by Mikhail Mikishin, was outright chauvinistic. Chmielnicki's horse was dropping a Polish szlachik, which is their term for a nobleman, Jewish leaseholder, and a Jesuit from a cliff, in front of which a little Russian, red Russian, white Russian, and a great Russian listened to a song. Right. So it's no secret in Ukraine that Chmielnicki was the person who fought against the Poles, the Jews, and the Jesuits. Okay, now we need to do a little bit of an understanding of Ukraine, and especially the eastern side of Ukraine and the Crimea and the what is now a place which is in the news all the time, the Dnipro River. You have a group of people, the Tatars. The Tatar is this gentleman on horseback on the right with the bow and arrow. This is a group of people who are sort of left over from the Golden Horde. They're sort of a Mongol leftover. They are aligned with the Ottoman Empire, and they are essentially slave traders, and they say they're sort of land pirates, and they are constantly attacking the Ukrainian settlements, the Polish settlements. The areas of sort of central Ukraine, sort of Kiev and eastward, these were once upon a time places that were settled by free Polish peasants, subsistence farming, maybe a little bit more than subsistence farming. And slowly the Polish nobility sort of encroach, and they take over this system, and they take over these lands, and they displace a lot of these Ukrainian peasants. And the Ukrainian peasants keep moving eastward, but now they're without land, and they sort of become this cultural group of Cossacks. Cossacks were cowboys. They're people who live somewhat nomadically, although there were certainly Cossack villages, and they were ruled in these sort of democratic ways by hetmen who would be elected by them, and they had war councils, and it was I shouldn't say an unstructured society, but it wasn't a fully organized state. You had lots of different Cossack groups, and you have this sort of odd situation where this ecosystem where the Tatars are raiding into these Polish settled areas, and they're capturing the peasants who are doing this farming, this sort of sharecropping. The Polish set up a set of forts, and then the forts, because they're occupied by these Cossacks, they sort of rebel and they become independent. And the the Polish sort of contract with the Cossacks to defend the settlements against the Tatars. But the Polish, they're very greedy and really not terribly reputable, and they end up often reneging on their pledges. Here's just an overlay map, which kind of shows you where Poland was, where the Khanate is. The Khanate is the lands of the Tatars. You can see where Muscovy is, sort of what will become Russia later on. And you see the Ottoman Empire. And just to kind of give you a flavor of what everything is, over here is Wallachia. Wallachia is where Vlad Dracula is. And this is a really brutal time. You know, Vlad Dracula is also known as Vlad the Impaler, right? So he's the guy who intimidates everyone by sort of taking a blunt stake and inserting it from a person's rear, going all the way up, and a good impaler knows how to miss all the vital organs, and they leave them on a stake. This is a very brutal time. And people, you'll see that the brutality, you know, when I gave this class on Shabbat afternoon, people asked, well, why are they so brutal? I think part of it is, it's like there's an intimidation factor here. You know, the scarier you are, the less you have to fight. And there was definitely an intimidation issue that was going on. But what I want you to take out of this, just a quick summary, is that you have this tug of war. You have the Tatars who are coming in, they're raiding, they're taking slaves. Slaves, by the way, up to and about 10,000 people a year. This is a slave market which would rival the African slave market that was taking Africans over to the Caribbean at around the same time. This is there is a story here. We will see parts of it. Part 2 is going to be much more focused on the slave trade and what happened to Jews in the slave trade and how Jews were involved in the slave trade. That's a very important part of this story, but it's just too much to do in one sitting. You have these slavers on the one hand going in, and the Poles are contracting with the Cossacks as their defense, but the Poles don't always pay up when they want to. And what the Poles did also, as part of the inducement for the Cossacks, was to register them. And registered Cossacks, or some of the Cossack hetmen, their leaders were promised lands. They were promised to become Polish nobility. But the Poles didn't exactly do that, or often, because Poland was not a very well-regulated place, it was sort of a free-for-all. Very often another noble lord might challenge the Cossack, pretend to give him lands, and then try and displace him later on, which is exactly what happens with Chmielnicki. Chmielnicki, the spark of this Chmielnicki uprising is because Chmielnicki was displaced from his lands by one of the Polish lords, and he then goes over to the Crimea, and he goes into the lands of the Khanate, and he's excellent at finding these Cossack groups and really whipping them up. He's a very charismatic personality, and he manages to unite both the Khanate and the Cossacks together against Poland. Okay, so just a little color on a Tatar invasion. This is a little letter from a French military engineer from 1640. Did I put in the wrong? Oops, I think I gave you the, sorry, I'm just gonna skip this. I do have a, he talks about, I think I pasted in the wrong, I gave you the, oh, maybe, well, we'll see. This is I think I pasted in here, not the, this is a letter from this community of Krakow, which we'll see later on. Okay, so why did all of this happen? So one, as I said, the Polish nobility failed to uphold their bargains. That we've covered. They said they were going to make Chmielnicki. They gave Chmielnicki land. They said you're now a Polish noble, and then one of the nobles displaces him from his land actually throws him in jail. It is actually Jews who give Chmielnicki the idea of how to get himself out of jail by getting pledges from some of his compatriots who will vouch for him, and he is freed and then whips up them again. So there's a lot of, it's a very complicated story in terms of how the Jews are involved. But the initial problem is that people are very disaffected with the Polish nobility and how they failed to uphold their bargains. There is also a significant amount of anger on a religious level because the Poles are Catholics and the Cossacks are Eastern Orthodox, and the Catholic priests were coming over and trying to convert the Eastern Orthodox Cossacks, and they were quite oppressive in that fashion. There is a side of the story which does not make us fully pure in this. I happen to disagree with the final conclusion of Heinrich Gretz, and generally speaking, nobody cares what Rosenblatt thinks. Heinrich Gretz is probably one of the most famous names in Jewish history. He writes this multi-volume set covering all of Jewish history. How he gets all of his knowledge is absolutely fascinating. But he is an important voice in Jewish history, and he's certainly one of the early voices. And his estimation is that the Jews were very much at fault. He clearly you can taste a little bit of his anti-religious focus. He spends a couple pages before this talking about how Jews were fascinated with the love of the Talmud. They get so engrossed in the Talmud that they can't see the forest through the trees. And this is what he writes. The Polish sons of the Talmud paid little attention to the fact that the Talmud and the great teachers of Judaism object even more strongly to taking advantage of members of different faith than those of their own race. The corruption of the Polish Jews was avenged upon them in a terrible way, and the result was that the rest of Europe, for a time infected with fatal blindness, Polish Jews offered the nobility and the Jesuits a helping hand in oppressing the Zaporizhian Cossack in the Ukraine and Little Russia. The magnates wished to make profitable serfs of the Greek Cossacks. The Jesuits hoped to convert the Greek heretics into Roman Catholics. The Jews settled in the district expected to enrich themselves and play the Lord over these pariahs. So here you already see that he feels that the Jews were complicit in this whole system. The Jews just wanted to get rich, and they were happy to, the Jews maybe had this sense that we had been the bottom of the social ladder for so long in so many places, and now finally there's somebody beneath us. That's the Zaporizhian Cossack. And so the Jew takes advantage of that. That's what I hear from Gretz. He says they advised the possessors of the Cossack colonies how to most completely to humiliate, it should say oppress, torment, and ill-use them. They usurped the office of judges over them and vexed them in their ecclesiastical affairs. So Gretz is very, very scathing about the Jews. I think that it's more complicated than that. I think the Poles were very greedy, the Jews were their agents, and the Jews get caught in between these two factors, that the Poles are overreaching in terms of how they're trying to squeeze the economy. The Jews are local, and the Jews are their agents. And let's face it, in that time, it wasn't such an easy thing for a Jew to say, okay, I'm going to pass up a livelihood because it compromises me to have to tell my local Cossack friends that in order to baptize their child, they need to give me 4 zloty. That, Gretz might be right that there's something very distasteful about it, but I think it would be very hard for Jews to not be involved in this manner when so many other forms of employment were not really open to them. But as usual, it's very hard for us to go back and judge, and I think that it perhaps, I would say, Gretz joins a lot of the religious processing of this as well. Generally speaking, in all of these tragedies, Jews assume guilt. They assume that Hashem is punishing them for something that they did. Gretz wants to make it all about their interpersonal relationship with the Ukrainians and not about any other religious matters. Obviously, the rabbis are going to take a broader approach, but everyone is going to compose prayers. All these rabbis are going to compose prayers about how this is a day that requires introspection and review, and why is this happening to us? But I think that Gretz has a
question, Rabbi?
in 1 second. I think Gretz has a very important point, which is the cautionary tale from history is Jews may be market makers and Jews may be managers of other people's wealth, but it's very important for us to culturally teach our children that you need to be respectful of other people, that sort of universal respect is exceedingly important. And I do think that that's a valuable lesson to take out even this week of Tisha B'Av. Yes, Des.
You said that it was difficult, this opportunity, given that so much else was shut off to them. But I thought you'd also said that we had quite a great amount of freedom while living in Poland during these days. Were we like confined to certain occupations and not allowed to enter into other occupations?
I think it's not purely about that. When you look at the whole picture, you see that the population grows and some people become wealthy and some people need to find a new place, and so your choices might be like they're not going to enter surf farming maybe, or they're wise enough not to know that that's a life that's not going to support their family and its future growth. So it's not like, oh well, either I'm going to be an accountant for KPMG or I'm going to work for the feudal lord. Their families were growing. You when you look at the evidence of these things, everybody needs to sort of expand. And so the question is, where do you expand to? It's not like I would, yeah. So maybe it's not fair to say that in Poland, perhaps I misspoke and said that they didn't have other professions open to them. They certainly had a number of professions open to them, and they had opportunities. But when these contracts came up, you would take them, and whereas maybe in central Poland you had to be a little bit more respectful, when you're in the Wild West, different rules apply, and people were obviously moving out there in order to support a burgeoning economy that's happening there. That's sort of the growth area, as I understood.
Right.
I could be wrong. Okay. So Chmielnicki is, as I said, he is dispossessed of his lands. He's very angry. He whips up the crowd. He finally makes a pact with the Tatars, and they attack together. And this is the course of their attack, right? May and June 1648, Chmielnicki's army joined by the Tatars defeat the Polish army. 24th of June 1648, 1,500 Jews massacred after being given up by the Poles to ransom their own lives, right? So the Poles betray the Jews in Tulchin. I'm going to save some of these other pieces of the timeline, because what we're going to look at next is actually how Jews wrote about this in their own words. And those own words, some of the fullest account of this comes from a contemporary, Rabbi Natan of Hanover, Rabbi Natan of Hanover. And he writes a book called, and this is I think an etching of him. He writes a book called Yeven Metzulah. The word Yeven Metzulah comes from the 69th chapter of the Tehillim, which I've quoted here for you. Lamanatzeach ala Shoshanim leDavid, for the leader of Shoshanim of David. Hoshi'eni Elokim ki bo mayim ad nafesh. Save me, God, because the water has reached my nostrils, has reached the point of human, the dividing line between human living and human death. Tavati bi'even Metzulah. So here, Safaria translates as I've drowned in the slimy deep. Other translations are the abyss of despair. And Yeven Metzulah means sort of the pit of this dark and horrible place. Ve'ein ma'amad bati b'ma'amikei mayim v'shibolet shetaftani. The water, I am sinking into the slimy deep and find no foothold. The waters have washed me away. The reason that Hanover takes the title Yeven Metzulah, the slimy deep, the deep abyss, is because Yeven if you take away the nikudot, the dots, it also can be read as Yeven, and Yeven is Greeks. And since the Cossacks were Greek Orthodox, that's his play on the words. That Yeven Metzulah, the deep abyss, is really the Greek abyss, right? So that's what the play on words is. This is a trigger warning for the next section. This is about the most gruesome thing you will ever see. And this is also, just absolutely shocking, the cruelty. So he writes, some of them stripped off their skin and threw the meat to the dogs, meaning the Cossacks, flayed people and then threw the human flesh to the dogs. And some of them cut off their hands and feet and threw them on the road and drove over them in wagons and trampled them with horses. And some of them inflicted many wounds on them so that they would not be able to die, and threw them outside so that they would not die quickly. And then they slaughtered the children in the bosom of their mother, and they would flutter in their blood until their souls came out. And many were buried alive. Many children were torn to pieces like fish, and women with fetuses had their bellies hatched, and the fetus were taken out and placed in their face. And some of them tore open their stomachs and put a live cat inside the stomach and left it there alive. And they sewed up the stomach and cut their hands with them so that the live cat would not be taken out of the stomach. Right? So just the cruelest act you could ever imagine. I don't think it says beten, but very often in Hebrew, beten and womb can be interchangeable. So that could be that's exactly what they did. They found a pregnant woman. They opened her up. I don't even know how you do this. And, how do you get the cat to stand still? And they put the cat in the body with its claws and all. And it just, the pain is just, and God forbid the woman would be able to pull out her own stitches. They cut off her hands. This is a cruelty of unspeakable dimensions. And some of them, and they hung infant children attached to their mother's breasts. And some children were impaled on skewers and roasted by the fire and presented to their mothers to eat the flesh. And sometimes they took the children of the Hebrews and made bridges to cross over them. There wasn't a strange death in the world that they didn't do to them. And all four of the courtroom deaths, Skilas, Sreifa, Hereg, V'chenek. Those are the three forms of death described in the Talmud. And the Kadarim, the Tatars, took many captives and women and virgins and slept with the women in front of the people. And the virgins and the beautiful women they took for maidservants and bakers for some women, and also concubines. So we can see that this is a brutal affair that and maybe the Cossacks were trying to vengeance got the better of them. Maybe this is how you whip them up for war, and maybe this is just to intimidate other people. This particular section, the next section of the Yeven Metzulah, is where he tells us that they sent out. You can see he's borrowing the language of Megillat Esther. He says, "Vayishlach svarim b'chom dinam dinah." That's almost a verbatim quote from the Megillah. Kesod gadol, they did it with great secrecy, right? And el mekamot sheyesh sham me'am haYevanim, places where there would also be other Cossacks. But what does it mean? Liot atidim liyom moed lihikahev la'amod al nafsham lashmid la'rog lavedet kol ha'Yehudim. So again, this is all languages borrowed straight out of the Megillat Esther, and he's saying that they were worried that the Cossacks were going to gather against them, and they sent word to fellow communities, and they also sent word to Polish nobles. And he says at the end, thank God who gave the cure before the disease. Because the cure is the Polish who are going to be in line with the Jews, and they're going to band together to protect themselves against the Cossacks. So this is a very interesting scenario, and it gives you a sense of the choice of the Jews between the two sides of what's going on. And he tells us that, in these different places, in Titov and Agfihen, they heard what the Greeks did to our brothers on the other side of the river Dnieper. And since the Tartars came upon them, and the Greeks and the Tartars were on one side, the Greeks were on the other side of the city, They said, if we wait until the Greeks come to the city and wipe us out, and we are slaughtered or force us to convert, God forbid, it is better for us to go to the Tartars' camp as captive slaves, because we knew that our brothers Beit Yisrael in Constantinople and other communities of Turkey are very merciful and will ransom us with money. You have to understand, there are two groups here, and they don't fight. They fight alongside each other, but they fight in two different camps, right? There's the Greek Cossacks, these sort of cowboy people, and then you have the slave traders, the Tatars. So the Jews, like the Cossack cruelty precedes them, right? Nobody wants to have their hands cut off. Nobody wants to find out that they've figured out a new way to stuff a cat inside your innards, right? That nobody wants to wait around for that. That's certain death. On the other hand, the other side of the city, who do you have? The slave traders. So the Jews basically said, we're going to go to the slave traders, and we know, and this we will deal with in tomorrow night's episode, we know the Jews in Constantinople will redeem us. How did they know that? How is that a factor? What was happening in Constantinople? That I'm going to leave as a mystery. That's taking place, that we'll discuss that whole picture tomorrow night. But this is their choice, death or slavery, and they choose slavery. I made a special point of letting people know whose last name might be Nemero, that we're going to be discussing this. This is the city of Nemirov, which is also a city which is famous because the Yud Lamed Peretz story, if not higher, talks about the Tzaddik of Nemirov. So it's a town in central Ukraine. I wish I'm having trouble figuring out how to toggle my screen, so I could go back to the map. I apologize for not being able to figure out how to do that, where you see the course of the Cossack rebellion, but maybe the third or fourth stop along that line is the city of Nemirov. And here in the city of Nemirov, for the sake of time, I'm going to condense it a little bit. What happens is that they open the gate because the Cossacks are flying a Polish flag, and it's essentially a false flag scenario. And it was the peasants in the city who also made a pact with the Cossacks and essentially sold out the Jews. And there's something like 6,000 Jews that died in Nemirov, and it happened on the 20th of Sivan. And this day, the 20th of Sivan, is not a sort of a random day in the calendar. The 20th of Sivan in Jewish history had been a fast day. It was a fast day because there were 30 Jews who were locked in a house and set on fire because of an accusation of ritual murder, of blood libel, in the year 1130. And this was a new form of accusation of blood libel because there was no body that was ever produced. One of the early blood libels is a story of William of Norwich. So there's a young boy, William of Norwich, who died, and so they had to explain the death, so they blamed it on the Jews. In this case, in the case of Bois, there were no Jews that died at all. There's no child that died at all. They just accused the Jews. And those Jews are put to the stake and burnt, accused of the blood libel, and the rabbi of the time, Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, declared it a fast day. So now we're some 500 years later, 500 years later, and now we come to the Chmielnicki, the massacre that takes place in the city of Nemirov. 6,000 Jews die in the city of Nemirov, and the Jews are looking for a response to this. And there are a number of different responses. First, the Jews of Poland were so well organized and so so well recognized that the Polish government gave them the ability to have their own council. It's called the Council of the Four Lands, the Vad Arba Aratzot, and that refers to the four different lands of Poland and Lithuania. And it says Bishnat Taf Yud, so this is the year 2 years after, Tanit Sibor, B'chaf Sivan, was established on the 20th of Sivan. This is sort of the official edicts of the community. They established a fast on the 20th of Sivan, Shana b'Shana, every year. B'yom shachla tzara b'kilat kodesh Nemarov, on the day when this tragedy took place in the Jewish community of Nemarov. This fast, by the way, was observed by every Ashkenazic Jewish community until the Shoah. It's very interesting that, one tragedy sort of pushes out another. Is that the Shoah makes Chmielnicki look like a backyard experiment, because maybe there were 40, 50,000 Jews in the end of the day who died in the Chmielnicki massacre. It's horrible. It's horrific. For that time period, it's horrible. But it's hard to compare it to 6 million. It's hard to compare it to I guess you can compare it to the Nazis, but certainly the Nazis, and in terms of its enormity, and certainly in our generation, its enormity, its proximity pushes out the 20th of Sivan. Although on Shabbat in the Shir, somebody said that actually on the 20th of Sivan in his yeshiva, they do observe. They say slichot. They don't have a fast day. But here it was a fast day, a regular fast day in Europe. This was their Yom HaShoah, right? This is how they. And Shabtai Katz, he writes a book called Megillat Ephah, the Scroll of Terror. He says, therefore I have ordained for myself and for the coming generation of my descendants day of fasting, sorrow, mourning, lamentations on the 20th day of the month of Sivan, because this day has been the beginning of persecution and pain, because on this day afflictions were doubled. For the persecution of 4931 was on the same day. So that's the event of Rabbi Tam, the Jews of France, of Bois, the 30 Jews who were burnt alive. And I have composed these slichot and laments with tears and supplications, same recited this day in each and every year. And he wrote one, as did the chief rabbi of Krakow, who wrote one. Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Heller was the chief rabbi of Krakow. He wrote one. It is a fascinating thing, though, that it seems that even though there were many of these prayers, these slichot, these penitential prayers, meaning we sinned, God forgive us, that are said on this day in the commemoration, they seem to always gravitate back to the older prayers. That there was some solace in knowing that this happened in the days of Rabbeinu Tam, and we managed to thrive thereafter. This is actually a good point. The book that I mentioned before, the Yeven Metzulah, where a lot of the narratives took place, and many of the ones that I presented to you here are from the Yeven Metzulah. In that book, the Yeven Metzulah, he estimates the number of people who died at maybe 200,000. There's a current researcher, his name is Shoel Stamfer. He's an excellent researcher on Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine. He has research also on the Khazars, and he basically looks at demographic research and looks at how many people lived in Ukraine before, how many Jews lived in Ukraine before, how many lived after, how quickly did it revive, and he estimates that Hanover's numbers are highly inflated. But he also says that there was a very speedy revival after the Chmielnicki massacres, which is also a fascinating thing. One other aspect that we haven't talked about at all is the idea that there were people who tried to save themselves, and maybe some of them did successfully save themselves by taking refuge in the Eastern Orthodox churches and converting in order to avoid these Cossack hordes. And for years after, the rabbis in Ukraine changed the text of benching. And their text of benching was Shelo nevos velo nichashel leolam va'ed. Shelo nevos velo nichashel leolam va'ed. That you do not you shall not trip or falter forever, meaning we shall not wither, and also I hope that God please protect me from ever giving in to temptation to convert in order to save my skin. Okay. This, by the way, I don't know what happened to my slide. I guess I did something wrong. But this is not a letter from the French military engineer who talks about the Cossack hordes. You've never seen anything like it with a dust cloud coming and horses riding. That was supposed to be on this slide. This is rather a letter in 1856, I think, 1856, of the Polish community of Krakow, which writes to other communities to speak of their, oh, actually, I think I do have it in the end. Yeah. Letter from Jewish community of Krakow, 1852. Of the dead, more have died of starvation than of plague. They could not be buried because they did not have the necessities, linen for the shrouds and wood for coffins. For that reason, many are laid on the ground until their bellies split. Their bodies became distended, and worms and maggots begin to eat them. Last Friday, 100 Jews were buried together, all because there were no coffins. The grave diggers themselves have died. Until now, more than 1,000 Jews have died, great students and pious leaders, the least of whom could have made a complete world. For our sins, those who survive are already weak and exhausted from starvation. Their situation is grave, and they have run out of money, even after we made a special collection before we left Krakow. Now, at our committee meeting here in Okluz, we have made another special collection for the poor, but that too will not be enough to cover even half of what they need. So first of all, one of the things you'll see here is that they are saying, because of our sins, that a very common Jewish response to take responsibility, to say this cannot be an accident, this cannot be just random. We must have done something wrong, and we have to go back and ask ourselves and look into ourselves and ask, why is this happening? Why are we being punished this way? That's number one. Number two is you can see that they're suffering in two ways. Number one is the Chevra Kadisha can't keep up. People are dying in such vast numbers that the Chevra Kadisha cannot make the burial shrouds fast enough. They can't get enough wood for the coffins. They're putting people into mass graves, and they're not following all the laws of Kvura because it's simply overwhelming them. That's number one. Number two is they are committed to taking care of the poor, but they can't do it on their own. It's just too overwhelming for them. And this sort of is going to be, this is my sort of transition slide to the next phase. The next phase is I want to not just look at the tragedy, not just look at all of the horrible things that happened, but also to look at the responses of kindness. So tomorrow night's episode is going to focus on two things. It's going to focus on how did Lithuania take care of the Jews that fled there? How did Amsterdam take care of the Jews? How did Krakow take care of the Jews? That's number one. Number two is we know that lots of Jews were taken slave in this operation. What happened to the Jewish slaves? What was the Jewish slave policy? How did Jews handle this whole picture of Jews involved in all levels of the, including as the slaves themselves, of the slavery problem that was rife within the Black Sea and the Mediterranean? That's going to be on tomorrow night. Okay, so maybe the one other thing I wanted to include, which I forgot to put in from the Yeven Metzulah, I'll just tell you what he says. He tells some stories about heroic women. One story is about a woman who is taken wife to a Cossack, and she does not want to have the marriage consummated. And so she tells her future husband, you know, I have magic powers, and you can shoot me with a rifle, and I will not die. And he believed her. She convinced him that she had that power. She was Superman. And so he loads up his rifle and he shoots her. And she does that so that she doesn't have to be defiled. There is another story that he tells of a woman who is in a similar position, does not want to marry her Cossack husband, does not want him to consummate the marriage, but she insists that she wants to get married in the church across the bridge with dancers and everything. And as they're dancing across the bridge on their way to the wedding, she dances left, she dances right, and then she dances over the bridge, and she takes her life by jumping over the bridge. The stories, they're are tragic. There's a certain kind of heroism, a certain epic of defeat that is sort of signature to the Jews, that does not want to be coerced or oppressed into that life. And Hanover tells us that, I think, certainly to give us a sense of the pity. Just this one last section. There are many people who wrote pieces of this, and so just not to tread over ground I've already treaded. This sort of the Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir of Shirshbin, in his Tzok HaItim, which means the stress of the times, it's a poem. But if you look at paragraph 15, he says, many women denied their religion and married the Greeks they had chosen. Many Jews broke the covenant, did not obey God's commandments, and transgressed them. Forced Jewish converts cared not to transgress, but have not sacrificed their souls. Only they remained alive. So this is just a picture of the fact that many people avoided the violence by conversion. This led to what I was referring to, that they will not trip and they will not betray their faith forever. So this is the story of the very gruesome, very sad story of the Cossack rebellion. There is a theory, probably not true, but a theory that at least you can understand, that this was such a horrible event that it was assumed that it must be something this horrible, must be the birth pangs of the Messiah. And then 15 or so years later, actually more like 18 years later, we have the story of Shabbatai Tzvi, the false Messiah. But this event was felt throughout almost all the Jewish world. The reason that this is probably not what gave birth to Shabbatai Tzvi is because there were many countries that were not really affected, like Yemen, as an example, by the Chmielnicki massacre, and they were also swept up in Shabbatai Tzvi. So there's another reason for Shabbatai Tzvi. The reason I mention that is because I want you to understand how impactful this was, and how this was a fast day. This was their Yom HaShoah for hundreds of years. This was maybe the single most impactful set of events that solidified a sense of real fear and trepidation in the minds of the Jews of Ukraine and Poland, and probably going to communities of Hamburg and Amsterdam, and even Constantinople.